Thank you, band. You brought us into holy ground this morning. Did you notice that the last two songs, they had rain even in the video? It's pretty amazing timing, Danny. But what they were saying in this song, singing in this song, is what Isaiah was sharing in his 55th chapter of his book, Isaiah 55. It's this amazing outpouring of God's grace and love to all of us, providing for us food without price. Oh, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you that have no money, come. Buy and eat, come buy wine and milk without money and without price, because God's grace is so... Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good and delight yourselves in rich food, the riches of God's grace. And so I want us to look at this table this morning we have set for you, and I want to talk about some of the various elements of the table that are here. I want to begin with the chair, because I had a chair that I always sat in at our table. Did you all have a regular seat that you occupied? That's why you pick the same seats here every Sunday, isn't it? But I was at the end of the table. As I say, there were 6 boys, mom and dad, and a couple of times, for a minute, I thought I was at the head of the table, but no, I was at the foot of the table. Mom was at the head, and Dad was beside her, and then we all were around, and powerful story that Esther shared, and I know her father and his ministry was shaped by that event, because he was so much for other people. Now, in our case, it was sort of get what you can get while you can get it kind of deal. And we had a wonderful time. It's one of my favorite places. But I had that seat, and you know, there's a wonderful thing about that. It's nice to have your place, isn't it? You know you belong, that's where I belong, and that's my setting, and that's my seat. The challenge is, as you grow older and you move away and you come back, you're still at that same chair. Have you noticed that? You're in that same, when I go back home, I'm not Reverend Dan, I'm Danny. I'm back when I was 10 or 12 or whatever, and I thought of pulling the trump card and say, hey, don't you know I was the pastor of a 4,000-member church in Gainesville? They don't care. I even thought of sending them a picture of this amazing church. They don't care. We get in roles, don't we? And sometimes we keep people in roles. You have to be careful of that, don't you, as your kids grow up, that you don't keep them as they always were, but they can be different. They can live into who they are. It's challenging because we kind of remember there is a hierarchy, at least back in Mingo, where I grew up. I hope you let people be who they are and who God sees them, and not how the hierarchy. The other thing I wanted you to see is this praying hands. Do you still pray at meals? It's maybe challenging, easy not to get into the habit where you don't pray, but it's a way of just acknowledging gratitude to God. It's a lifestyle. It's an appreciation that these gifts that we don't deserve, they're on this table, and it nurtures a sense of gratitude. We farm boys up in Ohio would like to tell the story you've probably heard about the farmer who had to go to Cleveland to some business deal, and he had his bib overalls on like my dad always wore, and he was nervous in Cleveland. He had to go to the bank and do some things, and then he went to one of those big cafeteria-style restaurants, Morrison's or whatever they're called, Piccadilly or chock full of nuts, whatever. So he got through there, and he got his tray, and have all those choices, and people want you to move, and he's sort of traumatized by that. I've been there. I know what that's like. And he finally got to his place, and he sat down, and he bowed his head and prayed. And when he looked up, there was a person who had sat down across from him, a big man, big mustache, and a condescending smile. And he said to the farmer, "I guess you live down in the country, is that right?" "Yeah." "I guess you farm, huh?" "Yeah." "Well, does everybody down there on the farm pray before they eat?" He thought a minute and he said, "Well, I guess almost everybody except the hogs, they just grunt and dig in." Praying is important, isn't it? Just takes us to that place of gratitude. I asked Anita to fill this table. A napkin. I have a white napkin and a red napkin. Which do you tend to use? The white flag of peace at your table? Do you nurture peace? Or is it the white flag of surrender at meals where you just give up? You know what I'm saying? It's more than just a napkin, isn't it? Or do you ever pull out the red flag of the matador? Mealtime should not be power struggle times or times where you lower the horns or egg people on. Did any of you remember a long time ago that movie Al Pacino was in called Scent of a Woman? Do you remember that one? There's a Thanksgiving scene. He comes uninvited to Thanksgiving and just throws the red flag. I mean, he destroys Thanksgiving. How was your Thanksgiving, by the way? It can happen. Sometimes we do that if we're not careful. Deborah Tanner tells a story about a young woman named Elizabeth in her late 20s. She's happily married, happily making Thanksgiving dinner for her extended family in her own home. Her mother's helping out and casually says to her daughter, I see you're putting onions in the stuffing." And the daughter feels like a teenager again and responds, "I'm making the stuffing, Mom. Why do you always have to criticize me?" "I didn't criticize you. I just asked a question. What's gotten into you? I can't open my mouth anymore." Do you think if a friend asked, "Oh, you're putting onions in the stuffing," would have had the same response? So sometimes it's of those dynamics that are going on that we don't even know. As I often say, it's never about what it's about. Be careful you don't just wave the red flag, or be careful you don't see a red flag that's not there. Words can be like a sharp knife, can't they? And we can use our words to cut another person, criticize another person, say things that all of us have said. Or we can use it to spread the honey or the butter. Which do you do? And then the glass, which is a symbol to me of overflowing joy and laughter. There ought to be a lot of laughter at our meals. You just pour and it flows. And then the fork. There's an old story, you've heard it, but I'm going to tell you again about the woman who was getting ready, nearly ready to die. She knew it was coming. She invited the pastor over and made arrangements for the funeral. And she said, "When I die, I want the funeral home to make sure that in the casket I'm laying there with a fork in my hand." And the pastor thought, that is really strange. But he didn't say that. "Tell me more about the fork," he said. "Well, you see, I grew up in the church, and every time we had a church dinner, we'd come near the end, and somebody would come by and take our plates, as they do every Wednesday night. But then they would say, 'But keep your fork, because dessert's coming.' So I want you to, when you talk about me in the service, I want you to point out that fork and tell people that the best part's just about to happen. I don't know if you have room at your table, but I hope you'll keep 2 unoccupied chairs. One for the unseen guest of Jesus and the Holy Spirit, that he might be present at every meal. It might be the conscious presence of the Spirit of God. Be present at our table, Lord. Be here and everywhere adored. These mercies bless and grant that we may feast in fellowship with Thee. And that it might be room for a guest who might just show up. My grandmother always kept an extra chair there because invariably somebody would come by and she'd say, "Oh, come on in for dinner." The New Testament writer Luke, in his 14th chapter, tells of Jesus, where Jesus tells 2 stories about a wedding banquet, a table setting. The first story, Jesus comes to a house of a prominent religious leader in time for dinner. And he noticed something fascinating. When it was time to come to dinner, the guests sort of elbowed each other to get to the most prominent place, pushed each other down or made sure they were, which caused Jesus to, let's see, are you all finding what you need? That's okay. I'm still got my train of thought, I think. So Jesus said, he used that as an example, a time to tell a story. And he said, a person gave a wedding feast. And people, when it came time, they did the same thing. They elbowed each other and made their way to the prominent seats. And when the guest of honor, when the head of the place came and made his seat, he looked around and saw that the guest of honor had been shoved to the very lowest spot. And there was this embarrassing moment when he had to tell the people who wormed their way to the top, you go sit down there, and told the guests to come up here. And he made the point that those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who are humble will be exalted, will be lifted up. It illuminates this great truth. Great truth. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. There's a lesson. And there's nothing wrong with the desire to be important, to excel, to live with dignity, to know who I am, to know who God says I am. Jesus spent a lot of his time helping timid people be strong and see themselves that way. The problem is not that. The problem is the sad, shabby way we push ourselves to the front sometimes. Push and shove. Most obviously, most recently, Roger Stone and Paul Manafort might come to mind. We do these things by sometimes criticizing others. It's a common one, isn't it? Trying to elevate ourselves by pushing others down. It never works. It makes us look small. Another way people try to find the seats of honor is self-promoting or being boastful. It's a common thing. It's just the human nature sometimes. God gave us 2 arms, 2 hands to put in front of our bodies, so it makes it hard to pat ourselves on the back. In preparation for February 17th, that one service where we're going to go back to the 50s, and the cars parked out there and overflow, hopefully out there, one service, I was thinking, boy, if I could look through some of the old sermons by J. Wallace Hamilton. And so, this past 2 or 3 weeks, I've been spending time in the second archives you have, and I found a bunch of sermons. And I found the perfect one for that day, part of which I can use, because he talks about dreaming big and looking to the future. But there's another one I found that he tells this story. Some of you may remember it. It's a great story. I never heard it before. It's the story of a frog who wanted to come to Florida from up north, Indiana, where it's 4 degrees temperature, or Pittsburgh or Newfoundland or somewhere. But he had no means of transportation, but he had some friends who were geese. So he had this wonderful idea, and he talked to his friends, and they bought into it. And so he found a piece of strong string and persuaded his geese friends, each one to take one end. And he, with his strong mouth, strong jaws, would grab the middle. And so they were doing wonderfully well, flying down from the north, him in the middle, until they got to around Gainesville, Florida. And there was a person on the ground who looked up and saw them and shouted out, "Wow, that's amazing. Who in the world invented that? That's just amazing that that could happen. Yeah, who invented that?" And the poor frog couldn't help but try to boast that he would be the one, and he said, "I." And the person had frog legs for lunch. Isn't that a great story? How we do ourselves in sometimes. It's a tendency. Jesus invites us to transition to these moments of greatness, who I am, through humility. Humility is not a namby-pamby, it's a great strength. Jim Collins, who wrote that famous book now, Good to Great, he studied all these great companies, learned all these great assets, and then he came to the final thing, and what would the leader of those great companies look like? What would he be like? What sort of charisma, what dynamism, what all those things? And he found out all his expectations were wrong. The characteristic of all level 5 leaders of great companies, he called them level 5, were humility and an iron will. Inner strength, humility, just kind of a regular person. When our kids were little, you can imagine Jan would just build them up all the time. I mean, she just, you could tell that with Jan, can't you? She just helped them feel better about themselves and always was affirming them. And I was reading this stuff about selfishness and self-centeredness, and I said to Jan one time, "You're going to make them so self-centered, they're not going to be humble." She looked at me like I was an idiot. No, she didn't do that. No. She was very patient. She didn't say, "Don't you know that's what I'm doing with you?" At the time, I didn't know, but she said something really powerful, something that went like this: you can't have a self to express itself in humility until you have a true, strong self. That self-effacement and self-abasement and lack of self doesn't help anybody. But she said it better than that, but you get the idea of what I'm trying to say. There's a second parable that Jesus tells. He talks about a banquet that a ruler gave and invited all the people around, and they all made excuses. Do you remember this story? I bought a field. I got to go check it out. I bought 2 oxen. I got to go check them out. I just got married. I can't do it. And then so Jesus, or the owner, tells people, go out and help bring the blind and the lame, and then go out in the highways and byways. That's why you need an extra chair. We got a lot of extra chairs. We can invite people. Now, I did something I haven't done in a long time, but I'm going to show you a video. It's a little longer, but you'll still be out in time. Any of you heard of Gregory Boyle? Anybody know the name Gregory Boyle? He's a Franciscan out in Los Angeles. He's a priest who was put into the worst gang-ridden place of Los Angeles. And he noticed he was burying kids in his parish about 2 or 3 times a month. And he said, I got to do something. And so they didn't have jobs. They couldn't get jobs. They were so many things on their record. He started a thing, you ought to look this up sometime, called Homeboy Ministries. And now they have a bakery, a homegirl cafe, a farmer's market, homeboy merchandise, grocery, silk screen and embroidering, catering, tattoo removal. They needed tattoo removal because the things they had on their bodies would keep them ever from getting a job. At any rate, he recently spoke at his alma mater, Gonzaga, and I think he tells a story that Jesus would have told. It's like the story of the great banquet. It's about 5 minutes, so sit back and watch this movie, okay? Let's watch Greg.
It's been the privilege of my life for 30 years to have been taught everything of value by gang members. And in the last few years, they've taught me how to text, and so I'm really grateful to them because I find it sure beats the heck out of actually talking to people. And I'm pretty dexterous at it, LOL and OMG and BTW. And the homies have taught me a new one, OHN, which apparently stands for, oh, hell no. And I've been using that one quite a bit lately. My alma mater, Gonzaga University, called me and said they were going to have a big talk on a Tuesday night with 1,000 people. And so I said, sure. And they said, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. I've never picked anybody more terrified of flying than this guy, Mario. He was just absolutely petrified. In fact, he was hyperventilating. And we hadn't even boarded the plane yet. And then our flight crew arrives, and I see 2 flight attendants, females, and they both have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the front steps. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. I should tell you that Mario, in our 30-year history at Homeboy, is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked there. His arms are all sleeved out, neck blackened with the name of his gang, head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that when he's lying in his coffin, there's no doubt. And so I'd never been in public with him, and we're walking and people are like this and mothers are clutching their kids more closely. I'm thinking, wow, isn't that interesting? Because if you were to go to Homeboy on Monday and ask anybody there who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works there, they won't say me, they'll say Mario. He sells baked goods at the counter at our cafe. He's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. So the nighttime talk comes, and it's 1,000 people, and I invite them up to share their stories in front of all these people for 5 minutes each. They were terrified, but they did a good job. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance, otherwise you'd get scorched. I invite them up for Q&A, and I said, yes, ma'am. And a woman stands and she says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario steps up to the microphone. He's a tall drink of water, skinny, and clutching the microphone, and he's terrified. Yes. And she says, well, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter who are about to enter their teenage years. What advice do you give them? What wisdom do you impart to them? And Mario clutches his microphone, and he's just terrified, and he's trembling, and he's getting a hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say when finally he blurts out, and he stops, and he retreats back to his microphone clutching, terrified retreat. But he wants to get this whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry, and she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hand, so overwhelmed with emotion that this room full of people, strangers, had returned him to himself, and they were returned to themselves And I think you go from here to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. And you stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And you stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and you stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear, and you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. Make those voices heard.
Do you think that Pasadena Community Church can dare to dream again? To reach out to the highways and the byways. Give people dignity and love and grace. Almighty God, we come to you, moved deeply by Father Gregory Boyle's story and Mario, which is a living example of this parable of Jesus to go out the highways and byways. Bring into each of our lives this week 3 people, 5 people that you are moving in their lives and want us to reach out and embrace. For the table of Jesus is unending. It's a table of plenty and a table of grace. Come. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Stand.